You have questions? We have answers. Welcome to the Therapist Question Box with your host, Miss Lindsay Schiss.
Welcome back to another episode of the Therapist Question Box, where we are not afraid of your toughest questions. So ask away. Today I have with me John Bowers, who is a therapist at Therapy Utah, and we are going to be talking about scrupulosity and OCD. John has presented to thousands of people on this topic, and we are lucky to have him. Thanks, John, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, John, in a nutshell, how would you describe scrupulosity?
Great question. So, scrupulosity is essentially moral OCD. And if we take a step back and examine like what the traits of OCD are, we can better have a better framework for what scrupulosity is. So OCD in general affects about 1% of the population, and it's essentially an anxiety disorder where an individual is triggered and then feels compulsed, urged to take an action that somehow neutralizes that anxiety. And a person can be scrupulous and not have this disorder. So some people have a perfectionism that has become so toxic that it's ruining their lives. And that could be kind of a scrupulous person, especially if you're filtering it through a moral or a religious lens. But with scrupulosity, it is essentially OCD latching onto someone's spirituality or morality. So this affects people that are religious and people who are atheist.
Because it's about morals.
Yeah. Okay. So I've treated and worked with a number of people who are former members of a religion who have felt that the only way that they could find peace was to leave the religion because of the obsessive, just tyrannical nature of this disorder. And yet they find that it's perpetrated into their transitioned life, where they're obsessed with doing the right thing in the right way, even if they're not beholden to any kind of creed or religious framework.
Interesting. So that's an interesting perspective, that it's really can go with you regardless if you are a part of a religious framework. When you said something about compulsions, why OCD is very much connected with compulsions, right? Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by compulsions and why that feels like it helps ease the anxiety of somebody with OCD? Yeah.
So with OCD, sometimes people have kind of a logical urge that comes. So if someone is very concerned about health, and something really important to note about OCD is that it tends to latch onto things that you really, really care about. So if someone's very concerned with health, a lot of times their OCD will latch on to sanitation. And so they'll feel a compulsion to wash their hands, or to wash their hands a second or third time to make sure they did it the right way and did it enough. And that compulsion tells their brain that they're okay. And the anxiety has been building up to the point where they feel like they have to do something, and it's neutralized for a temporary period of time.
Which is, when you say that, it makes me think there's a reason why it feels so big, because these are things that mean a lot to the people, right? So if you said, okay, cleanliness means a lot to these people, and so what are they going to do? Washing their hands it gets to be an obsession for them, right? So really washing hands or doing something that helps ease that burden or that angst, and in an effort to make it diffuse it a little bit, right? Does it work? Does it work? So if I have that obsession, in fact, as you're talking about it, I'm laughing because I'm thinking I have a little bit of cleanliness. I feel like OCD, and maybe not cleanliness, but germs. When I touch something, if I shake your hand on my right hand, I will remember that hand has been shook by you until it has been washed. And when it's washed, then I feel like I can eat whatever. But until then, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. In fact, when I there's a funny story when I went camping years ago, and someone said, "Who brought the nibs?" And I looked around like, I didn't bring nibs. Did anyone else bring nibs? No, but what I brought were Twizzlers, and I ate them down to the very little tiny bit. And then I just had a little pile that ended up looking like nibs, but it really wasn't nibs, but it was where I had touched. Right. So, so, right. But I was I was nervous about eating them, and that was my way of handling it. So as I'm saying that, does it make you think, okay, maybe there is maybe you have OCD, maybe I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is germs are something in my mind that has been prominent for me. So my way of easing that anxiety, would you say that was just by not touching them and just laying them aside, so I wouldn't have to worry about my potentially dirty hand touching something that was going in my mouth?
Yeah. So, and thank you for sharing that extra story. So I don't take it personally that you obsess over me shaking your hand. And
it's not you personally, John. I'm just telling you.
I'm just kidding. But that's a really good point, because one of the features that is somewhat similar to PTSD in that people with OCD will often avoid things that trigger them. So people with scrupulosity a lot of times will think, I can't go to church or I can't go to synagogue because if I don't recite this prayer right, then it's bad, it doesn't count. And so then this ritual doesn't count, it doesn't work. You're sent into this spiral, and you feel like you have to either suffer at this place of worship or in this religious context, or you have to avoid it. So which is
so interesting, because what they're doing is, I would imagine when people are going to mass or they're going to take sacrament or whatever it is, that they're going to find peace and to find connection with the divine or whatever it is for them. But in fact, it actually does the opposite. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and it's scrupulosity is so insidious because it robs people of the reason why religion is appealing. People will turn to religion for a sense of purpose, a sense of peace, of comfort, of direction, but scrupulosity turns it into torture of, if I'm not doing this right, then God is mad at me, or my higher power won't protect me. And so they become obsessed with, am I getting the direction from God, or am I this filthy, sinful creature that is disconnected from God?
And it's the reason, because if I'm not doing it right, then I don't have full access to God's power, to his light, whatever it is. Is that it?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Okay. So it's interesting because a lot of people will misinterpret these OCD urges as some kind of spiritual prompting, or the fact that they're anxious is an implication that God is angry or displeased with them in some way. And so a lot of these behaviors are trying to avoid damnation, or to curtail some of the anger that their higher power has toward them.
Interesting. And like you said, that does not feel peaceful. That actually feels like the exact opposite.
Right. Yeah. So part of what I try to help clients identify, and it's very important to meet with a clinician that is culturally and religiously sensitive around these things, because it's very easy to get prescriptive, but if you don't really understand the context and framework of this person's religion or spirituality, then it's going to be harder to help them to parse apart what is religion and what is their spiritual truths and what are our mental compulsions
Got
and
it.
anxiety. So one of the things that I will do is I'll get on the whiteboard and say, okay, what to you is the difference between anxiety and a spiritual prompting? And sometimes I have to kind of give ideas, but a lot of times people can identify, yeah, I've had spiritual promptings or spiritual experiences where I felt peace, where I felt a sense of hope or direction or a sense of connection, or, fill in the blank, warmth, whatever. And you can make a big list of that. And then you can ask, okay, so when you're feeling like you're in these really intense thought cycles, or you're feeling these huge urges to go and confess something again, even though you've already confessed it, or fill in the blank, whatever compulsion it is, what is that experience like for you? And they say it's frenzied, it's panicked, it's immediate, it's urgent, it's life or death, which it and I can't speak for every religion, but it seems like many, there isn't this sense of every little thing is a life or death issue. These promptings should be gently pulling you back into alignment with the values that you hold.
Yes. And actually, as you were saying those things, what came to my mind, frenzied, worried, racing, that sounds like anxiety to me. I'm hearing that. And I think that's just anxious, right? We're just like, this is anxiety and it's coming out in this way.
Yeah. So there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. And with OCD, with scrupulosity, because we're getting a little more specific with scrupulosity, a lot of these compulsions look to other people like good things. And it goes unnoticed or undiagnosed, and sometimes it gets rewarded because people see, oh, these people are just super devout, they're taking their religion very seriously. But it's a lot darker than that. These people are questioning their behaviors and worrying that they've made the wrong choice, or they didn't do it for the right reason, or maybe they had like some kind of sinful desire in there, or okay, I've had this heretical or sexual thought that isn't aligned with my values, but they assign this huge meaning to these thoughts that pop into their mind. And then your brain, because you've shown it that it's relevant or that this thought is important, will bring it back into your mind. And so then they freak out that it's happening again. So this must mean that I'm this sinful person. So how can I get this out? So I'm going to read sacred texts for hours. I'm going to pray and pray and pray and ask for this, to be forgiven for this thought. Or I'm going to go confess. I'm going to go to confession. I'm going to talk to a bishop and just try to get it all out on the table. It's just this constant need for reassurance.
Right. And as you're saying that, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, which is it's something that's important to you. Then you have a thought that feels counter to it. And so that feels worrisome. And so what are we going to do? We're going to focus and make it a big deal, right? It's kind of the idea of like, if I were to say, John, here's a pink stuffed animal. Do not think about the pink stuffed animal. And where does your brain go? It goes right to that pink stuffed animal. And especially if you have an affinity for pink stuffed animals, that is going to be where your brain goes. So it makes a lot of sense. And I'm hoping that we can help this listener with some of their questions about scrupulosity. So let me go ahead and read the question and we'll see if I would love to hear your insights. Here's the question. I've been struggling with scrupulosity. I often find myself constantly doubting my thoughts and actions, fearing that they're sinful or morally wrong, even when there's no evidence. This leads to a lot of guilt and anxiety, and I end up overanalyzing everything from what I say to what I think. Can you help me know how to break free from this cycle of doubt and overthinking? How can someone learn to trust themselves again and find peace in their beliefs without getting stuck in obsessive loops? Well, this is exactly what we're talking about. So, John, where would you start with this listener?
Yeah. And first of all, I just have so much compassion for people in this situation because it truly is torturous. And it's very distressing because a lot of times these people are feeling that this is indicative of their eternity. So these things are really important. And it's deserving of sensitivity, and I'll try to be delicate while also being assertive, which is an interesting balance in OCD treatment, because there is this enormous desire to have external reassurance, but it's never enough. So there are difficult things that you'll have to do in confronting this. So first of all, we have this pattern of cyclical thoughts. And something interesting about scrupulosity is it's often considered a pure OCD, meaning it's more about the obsession, and the compulsions tend to be more mental than physical. So it's a nice rule that I encourage everyone to try and adopt is, if it feels like OCD, it is OCD.
Why is that helpful?
Because when we are dealing with people or dealing with this friction between what is a spiritual prompting and what is a mental disorder, it can be very terrifying to act as if it's a mental disorder, because it sounds like so much is in the balance.
Sounds scary.
Yeah. But if your higher power is all-knowing and all-powerful and benevolent, then I imagine this higher power knows what a mental illness is. And understanding the complexities of that. So I imagine that there's going to be some mercy as you figure it out. But when we act on these obsessive thoughts over and over, or continue to entertain them, then they're reinforced and they gain more power.
That makes sense. Okay. So if it feels like OCD, it is like, we're just going to treat it as if it is OCD.
Right.
Good.
And if you need to, pray to just say, I am not an expert on this. I am trying to figure this out. If I miss a prompting here and there, I'm sorry, but I'm doing this so that I can fully embrace my religious views and and have a devotion that's based in faith and love rather than fear.
Yep.
So yeah.
How would you encourage this listener to break the cycle? I mean, I think that's when I think of OCD, it's a cycle, right? It's just this reel that keeps playing again and again in your mind. How would you help this listener say, there's some strategies where you could break this cycle of doubt and overthinking?
Yeah. So one method is, if you're worried about a particular situation that you were in, it can be helpful to take a curiosity, a pure curiosity curious approach, rather than assuming malintent. So you can ask, okay, on the typical day, am I going about trying to be sinful? Am I going about trying to get away with doing bad things? Is that something I do? And sometimes people will say, yes, I'm this horrible person and I do things bad all the time. And you kind of have to walk that back and say, okay, that doesn't sound actually very honest. So, okay, what are the odds that I was purposely sinning? Okay, probably not very high. Another aspect is, okay, if I've already thought this through and I've thought it through 100 times, then my brain is lying to me and telling me that if I think about this enough, I'm going to figure it out. Whereas in reality, you've probably beat this thing to death, which this person may recognize. But okay, how can I just say, I've thought about this. I'm going to practice surrendering. One of the approaches I take is through acceptance and commitment therapy, but just practicing radical acceptance is going to be helpful in facing the anxiety. And it can feel just very counterintuitive, which is probably the reason that most people don't take this approach.
And probably the reason it's called radical.
Right. Yeah.
Because it feels counterintuitive to accept it. It's everything you don't want to accept, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So playing into the idea that the higher power is benevolent, because I think, I mean, from a logical standpoint, if you know everything about someone, you're going to have so much grace for them. It's hard to hate up close.
Yes.
And if God understands where you're coming from, just fundamentally, it would make sense that God would be gracious. So it's interesting. And I know I'm going back and forth, but another important thing to know about scrupulosity is that it's actually antithetical to faith. With scrupulosity,
isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
I mean, you would really think it's the exact opposite. The reason you're scrupulous is because you're trying so hard. Why is it antithetical to faith?
Yeah, because there is this intense need to be perfect, to have complete assurance that God is pleased or satisfied with your behavior. You are obsessing over things that you've done, and scrupulosity often has kind of this backward-facing anxiety as opposed to a traditional, just everyday anxiety is usually forward-focused. You're obsessing over things that have already happened, so you can't really prove a lot of things. You can't go back to that exact point and know everything.
Sure.
And then that's juxtaposed with this fear of this completely unverifiable future where you don't know if there's a heaven or hell or all of these things or what this next life is going to look like exactly. Even if you have a very strong belief, there's no way that you're really going to verify that unless you actually see it.
Yeah.
So that's not faith.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's trying to control something and trying to manage something. And when you say that, I think about perfectionism and just thinking, oh, perfectionism, well, on the front of it seems like, oh yeah, it's just someone trying to do the right thing. It's really trying to manage outcomes, right? I'm trying to be bulletproof so nothing can get in my way and nothing can hurt me.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that same thing. Like I don't want to have faith because that feels unsure and uncertain. I'm trying to control something and this is my way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I don't need redemption if I never make a mistake. Or
exactly.
All the dots. And this is definitely not coming from a place of judgment from me. These people have really good intentions. This is something that they take very seriously. And that's amazing. We need people to take their values seriously.
Exactly.
If you can understand fundamentally that in order to exercise faith, I have to accept and surrender to ambiguity and uncertainty. So,
acceptance is huge. When you're saying that, I really just think with so many parts of anxiety, right? This roots in anxiety is acceptance, just acceptance of what is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that is a hard thing to do, is to accept what is. Sometimes we just want to argue with reality. We want to control reality. So when you say radical acceptance, I think that word matters because it does feel radical in accepting something that feels like, I don't know, it's uncertain and I want to have certainty. I mean, I would imagine it would feel radical in the idea of accepting that. So you've talked about acceptance, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. What other treatment or recovery strategies do you see that are most helpful?
And the gold standard, as everyone says, is exposure response prevention, which is a subtype of cognitive behavioral therapy. And we're throwing all sorts of words around.
Mm-hmm.
But
can you explain what that is?
yeah,
When you say exposure therapy, give me an example of exposure therapy.
yeah. So I want to make it a little more specific to scrupulosity. So something that you can do on your own, but is often a lot more efficient to do with a therapist, is exposing yourself to the anxious situation, the anxiety trigger. So part of the and part of this acceptance that I was leading with is also applicable here. Fundamentally, we're trying to show your brain that this is not dangerous.
Mm.
Your brain is interpreting this anxious situation as dangerous, and I have to act in order to survive. So exposure therapy expands the window of tolerance because you're forced to sit with the anxiety. So if you're having this this thought over and over, and I have to figure out if I did it wrong or not, saying, okay, I'm not going to entertain this anymore. And I'm going to say, oh, well, maybe God is mad at me. Maybe I'm going to hell, and just try to sit. And you can meditate during this point. But you can have a mantra, which can be helpful for people that feel like they have to have something always present in their mind during a meditation so that they don't get distracted. But your brain will be screaming.
I was just going to say, John, this sounds horrible. For someone that's so afraid of this, to actually embrace it, it feels like everything you don't want to do.
Right.
And is this why you're saying it's helpful to do with a therapist? Because I would imagine the amount of discomfort that someone might experience doing this on their own might feel like it's just too much. No, thank you. This is exactly what I'm pushing away from. And now I'm trying to lean into it. It's so counter.
Yeah.
So
it's really, really hard. And so it's important to have a host of tools to use to mitigate and to work with your anxiety, but you're not doing the thing that your brain says will fix the problem.
Yeah.
So this looks like breathing exercises. A lot of times when people are stuck in cyclical thoughts that are intrusive and just torturous, focusing on the breathing and being completely involved in this meditation practice where I am completely in my body. I'm focusing on physical cues. I'm paying attention to different sensations as I'm giving my brain more oxygen, just giving yourself a little bit of a distraction almost, but your brain is still saying, okay, but remember me, remember this thing. And it's actually, for right now, I'm surrendering. So for Christians, it can look like, okay, I'm surrendering to Christ. I'm going to put this burden at his feet, and he's going to be merciful. If I grab it again and try to figure it out again, and I have to lay it down again, I imagine that he would feel bad and for people that are suffering. And it's something that you have to trust and practice faith in, that your religious views are part of a divine plan of grace.
Yes.
Of some kind of positive intention from your higher power.
I like that. And it reminds me when you said that there's a benevolent God, that God is benevolent. It's reminding yourself of those things. So a couple of the nuggets that I've taken away is really, first, that curiosity approach rather than assuming malintent, like that it's just curious. What's going on with my thoughts when I'm thinking this? I loved what you said. If it feels like OCD, it is OCD. So just treat it as such. And that surrendering, and just again, surrendering, acceptance, and not just acceptance, but radical acceptance, because it's everything your brain doesn't want to do. And that some of the therapies that can be most effective are exposure therapy, and again, helping the brain understand that this is not dangerous. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we cover before we end that feels really important around this topic?
Yeah, I think, well, part of the problem is there is so much to say and so many ways that this can be manifested. So this is not going to be a comprehensive episode per se.
For sure.
You can look up OCD thought charts online. There should be options available. I think that I want to say the Beck Institute has some, but just it helps you to chart out, okay, what triggered these thoughts? What triggered this anxiety? What's the belief that is in question? What are the consequences that I'm worried about? And how can I dispute? How can I fight back a little bit on this?
Okay, so what triggered the belief? And go ahead.
What triggered the anxiety?
Triggered the anxiety. What's the belief?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And what are the next steps? Say it again.
Yeah. So, and what are the consequences I'm worried about?
Consequences, yeah.
And then you dispute it. So how can I practice what's the most gracious excuse I can have for the behavior I did? Or if I asked 1,000 people if what I did was wrong, how many of them would say yes? 1,000 people from my religious background, per se. So you could like, if you threw away paper into the trash instead of the recycling bin, is this something that I have to go back to my church and put it in the right bin? Or some things like that. If the average person is going to say no, it's fine, then okay, great. So then and the next step would be try to eliminate the anxiety by saying, I can't be happy and peppy all the time. Sometimes I'm going to be anxious. And just because I'm stressed doesn't mean that I am sinning or that I'm doing something wrong. And just because a thought comes into my head doesn't mean that I necessarily chose that thought. We don't have a lot of control over what thoughts come into our mind. But if we treat thoughts as relevant, they're more likely to come back.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then next step would be analyzing, okay, how do I feel after kind of sticking up for myself? And then how do I just move on? How do I take the next step?
Nice.
So
I really appreciate those concrete tools and steps that people can take to try to understand when they have an intrusive thought. Even if you don't feel like maybe you suffer from scrupulosity or OCD, those are really valuable tools for just intrusive thoughts that we all have, right?
Yeah. The leaves on the stream meditation, you can look that up. It's an acceptance and commitment therapy approach. It's very, very helpful because you start recognizing these thoughts are coming out of nowhere, and they'll come right back, and you say, okay, I'm just noticing that I'm having this thought. I didn't think, okay, can I think of something really, really sexual or really, really deviant or violent or sacrilegious? No, you're just sitting there and things pop into your head.
Yeah.
And that's part of being human. So those are tools that you can use in the moment. If you were to come into my office, I may use accelerated resolution therapy to address some of the anxiety. So I would have you picture being in a situation where the scrupulosity might be triggered. It could be that you walk by a bar and you're terrified that you are doing something wrong. If your religious background, there are many religions that prohibit alcohol consumption. So maybe I'll have you picture that, and I'll help you to then work on your physiological responses as far as anxiety goes, and just help you with that. Exposure therapy may look like, okay, I'm going to have you go to the grocery store and hold a can of beer. I wouldn't ever encourage someone to do something that is obviously against their religious views. So I'm not going to tell an Orthodox Jew to go eat a hot dog, but maybe you need to go stand by the pork section.
And that would feel like enough exposure that might be upsetting, right? And to recognize, okay, I'm still safe, even though I'm standing in this section that feels a little threatening, right? Yeah. And you know what you said about ART, or accelerated resolution therapy. We will do another episode on that because it is an amazing form of therapy to help people work through some of these things. So we really hope that this discussion has shed some light, not just on OCD, not just on scrupulosity, but on anxious and intrusive thoughts that we all have experience with. John, I really appreciate your insights and your time, and hope that, again, this can shed some light and some hope for those that have been struggling or have loved ones that have struggled with this issue. We appreciate you listening. If you like this episode, please rate and review, and we'll see you next time.